Picture this. You're Arthur Morgan and you've just been told you have tuberculosis in 1899. No cure exists. Death is certain. But here's the thing, this diagnosis doesn't destroy Arthur Morgan. It creates him. Red Dead Redemption 2 gave us something extraordinary. A masterclass in how a real man faces his end. And what Arthur teaches us about masculinity, honor, and redemption will shake you to your core. I've spent countless hours analyzing Arthur's journey, and I need to share something with you. This isn't just about a video game character. This is about what it truly means to be a man when everything you thought you knew about yourself crumbles away. Arthur Morgan shows us that the strongest thing a man can do isn't avoiding death, it's choosing how to live when death is inevitable. Let me take you through the most powerful transformation in gaming history. A story that will change how you think about strength, loyalty, and what it really means to die with honor. Arthur Morgan wasn't born a philosopher. He was born into violence. Orphaned young, taken in by Dutch van der Linde and Hosea Matthews when he was barely a teenager. They didn't just raise him, they molded him into something specific. A weapon. A tool. The perfect outlaw. For 15 years, Arthur lived by one simple code. Loyalty above all else. Dutch says jump, Arthur asks how high. Dutch says kill, Arthur pulls the trigger. Dutch says rob, Arthur plans the heist. This wasn't blind obedience, this was family. The van der Linde gang wasn't just a criminal organization to Arthur. It was his entire world, his identity, his reason for existing. Think about that for a moment. Imagine your entire sense of self being wrapped up in serving someone else's vision. Arthur never questioned it because he never had to. Dutch was brilliant, charismatic, a natural leader with grand dreams of freedom and rebellion against a civilized world that had no place for men like them. And Arthur? Arthur was the loyal son, the dependable right hand, the man who made Dutch's dreams reality through blood and bullets. But here's what makes Arthur's story so devastating, he was good at it. Terrifyingly good. Arthur Morgan could track a man across 3 states, outdraw anyone foolish enough to face him, and intimidate information out of people just by walking into a room. He was Dutch's perfect soldier and for years that was enough. It had to be enough because Arthur never allowed himself to imagine anything else. The gang was everything. Micah Bell, the rat who whispered poison into Dutch's ear. John Marston, the brother who couldn't see past his own selfishness. Abigail Roberts trying to build something real for her son Jack. Susan Grimshaw holding the camp together through sheer force of will. These people were Arthur's entire universe, and he would die for any of them without hesitation. But something was changing. Even before the tuberculosis, even before everything fell apart, Arthur was starting to see cracks. Small things at first. Dutch's increasing paranoia. His willingness to take bigger risks for smaller rewards. The way he'd started listening more to Micah and less to Hosea. Arthur felt it in his gut, something was wrong. But loyalty, that bone-deep loyalty that defined him, kept him from voicing his doubts. Then came Blackwater. The botched ferry job that should have been simple but turned into a massacre. The gang fled into the mountains, and suddenly their world of certainty became a world of desperate survival. But even then, even as everything started crumbling, Arthur held fast to his faith in Dutch. Because what else did he have? Without the gang, without Dutch's vision, who was Arthur Morgan? The answer to that question was about to change everything. But first, Arthur had to get sick. He had to start coughing up blood in the middle of a debt collection. He had to feel his strength, his one reliable constant, beginning to fail him. Only then could he begin to discover who he really was underneath all that loyalty and violence. And that discovery would transform him from a simple outlaw into something much more dangerous. A man with nothing left to lose and everything left to prove. The coughing started small. Just a tickle in his throat after a particularly brutal fight in Valentine. Arthur Morgan, the toughest man in the van der Linde gang, thought nothing of it. Men like Arthur don't get sick, they get injured, they get shot, they get beaten, but they don't get sick. Sickness is for weak men, and Arthur Morgan was anything but weak. But the cough persisted. And got worse. Soon there was blood, first just specks on his handkerchief, then more substantial amounts that he couldn't ignore. Still, Arthur tried to push through it. This was just his body protesting years of hard living, hard drinking, and harder fighting. Nothing rest and whiskey couldn't cure. The gang noticed, of course. How could they not? Their strongest member was visibly weakening, struggling through fights that should have been easy, needing to stop and catch his breath after simple tasks. But nobody wanted to acknowledge what they were all thinking. Because if Arthur Morgan could be brought low by something as simple as illness, what did that say about the rest of them? Dutch, in particular, seemed determined to ignore Arthur's declining health. Perhaps because admitting Arthur was sick meant admitting their whole world was fragile. Or perhaps because Dutch had already started down the path that would lead him to betray everything they once stood for, and acknowledging Arthur's mortality would have complicated his plans. But you can't ignore tuberculosis. It doesn't care about your reputation, your loyalty, or your dreams of freedom. It just consumes. Slowly at first, then faster, then unstoppably. Arthur found himself growing weaker by the day, his legendary stamina reduced to nothing, his hands shaking as he tried to hold his gun steady. The breaking point came during a routine debt collection. Arthur was supposed to intimidate some poor farmer into paying money he clearly didn't have. It should have been simple. Arthur Morgan's reputation alone was usually enough to settle such matters. But as Arthur cornered the man, explaining in his gravelly voice what would happen if the debt wasn't paid, the coughing fit hit. Not just coughing, violent, uncontrollable spasms that brought up blood and bile and left Arthur gasping on his knees in the dirt. The farmer, moments before terrified for his life, now looked down at this legendary outlaw with something approaching pity. And in that moment, Arthur saw himself clearly for the first time in years, not as Dutch's trusted lieutenant or the gang's enforcer, but as a sick, dying man who had spent his life hurting people for money. The doctor in St. Denis confirmed what Arthur already knew in his heart. Tuberculosis, advanced stage. No cure available. Maybe a few months, maybe less, depending on how well he took care of himself. The doctor spoke clinically, professionally, as if he was discussing the weather rather than a man's death sentence. Arthur walked out of that doctor's office a different man than the one who had walked in. Not because the diagnosis surprised him, on some level he'd known for weeks what was killing him. But because for the first time in his adult life, Arthur Morgan was truly alone with his thoughts. No Dutch to follow, no gang to protect, no mission to complete. Just Arthur and the ticking clock of his own mortality. And in that solitude, something extraordinary began to happen. Arthur started to think. Really think, not just react and follow orders. He began to examine his life, his choices, his legacy. What had he built? What had he created? What would remain of Arthur Morgan after the tuberculosis finished its work? The answers weren't pretty. Arthur had spent 15 years as Dutch's sword, cutting down anyone who stood in their way. He'd killed dozens of men, robbed countless innocent people, spread fear and violence across the frontier. All in service of Dutch's grand dream of freedom and rebellion. But what if Dutch was wrong? What if they weren't freedom fighters but simple criminals? What if Arthur had wasted his life serving a lie? These thoughts would have been unbearable for the old Arthur. But the dying Arthur found them liberating. Because if his old life was a lie, then maybe there was still time to live something true. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Old habits, old loyalties, old ways of thinking don't disappear just because you get a death sentence. But the tuberculosis gave Arthur something he'd never had before, clarity. When you know your time is limited, every choice becomes important. Every action carries weight. Every decision might be your last chance to do something right. Arthur began to see Dutch differently. The charismatic leader who had saved him from a life on the streets was still there, but so was something else. Paranoia. Desperation. A willingness to sacrifice anyone and anything to preserve his own vision of how the world should work. Dutch was becoming everything he'd always claimed to oppose, a tyrant who demanded absolute obedience and brooked no dissent. Micah Bell's influence over Dutch became impossible to ignore. This snake, this coward who hid behind Dutch's protection while whispering poison in his ear, was leading them all toward destruction. And Dutch, once so wise and careful, was listening, believing, following Micah down a path that could only end in blood and betrayal. But perhaps most importantly, Arthur began to see the people around him as individuals rather than just fellow gang members. John Marston wasn't just the irresponsible brother who couldn't be counted on, he was a young father trying to figure out how to be a good man for his family. Abigail wasn't just John's nagging woman, she was a mother desperately trying to protect her son from the violence that surrounded them. Jack wasn't just another mouth to feed, he was an innocent child who deserved better than a life on the run. The old Arthur would have dismissed these observations as weakness. Real men don't worry about feelings or families or the future, they focus on the job at hand. But the dying Arthur understood something the healthy Arthur never could. Sometimes caring about others is the strongest thing a man can do. This realization would drive everything that came next. Because Arthur Morgan wasn't just dying, he was being reborn. And the man who emerged from that transformation would prove that true strength isn't about never falling down. It's about choosing to stand up for what matters, even when you know it will cost you everything. With death breathing down his neck, Arthur Morgan began the most important work of his life, becoming the man he should have been all along. Knowing you're going to die changes everything. But knowing you're going to die soon, that transforms everything. Arthur Morgan woke up each morning unsure if it would be his last, and this uncertainty became a strange kind of freedom. When every sunrise might be your final one, you stop worrying about tomorrow's consequences and start focusing on today's choices. The gang was falling apart around him. Dutch's paranoia had reached fever pitch, convinced that every shadow hid a Pinkerton agent, every stranger was a potential threat. His grand speeches about freedom and rebellion now sounded hollow, desperate attempts to justify increasingly desperate actions. The man who had once inspired absolute loyalty through wisdom and charisma was now demanding it through fear and manipulation. Micah Bell sensed opportunity in Dutch's deteriorating mental state like a shark smells blood in water. Every conversation became an opportunity to whisper poison, to suggest that certain gang members weren't pulling their weight, weren't truly loyal, were potential traitors who needed to be watched. And Dutch, isolated in his paranoia, listened to these whispers with growing enthusiasm. But Arthur saw through it all now. The tuberculosis had stripped away his illusions along with his strength. He watched Dutch make increasingly poor decisions, saw Micah manipulate situations to his advantage, witnessed the slow destruction of everything the Van der Linde gang had once represented. And for the first time in 15 years, Arthur began to act independently. It started small. A choice here and there to show mercy instead of violence. Returning money to a widow instead of keeping it for the gang. Warning a target to leave town instead of hunting them down. These weren't dramatic rebellions against Dutch's authority, they were quiet assertions of Arthur's own moral compass, a compass he was only now learning to read. The gang noticed, of course. Micah was quick to point out Arthur's softness to Dutch, suggesting that maybe Arthur's illness was affecting more than just his body. Maybe it was affecting his loyalty, his judgment, his usefulness to the gang. These accusations cut deep because they contained a grain of truth. Arthur was changing, becoming something different from the unquestioning enforcer he'd always been. But instead of driving him back into line, these accusations only strengthened Arthur's resolve. Because what Micah saw as weakness, Arthur was beginning to understand as strength. Real strength. The kind of strength that comes from choosing to do right even when it's harder than doing wrong. John Marston became the focus of much of Arthur's newfound moral clarity. For years, Arthur had seen John as irresponsible, unreliable, more concerned with his own freedom than his family's welfare. But now Arthur saw something different. A young man struggling to balance his outlaw nature with his responsibilities as a father. John wasn't weak or selfish, he was scared. Scared of failing his son the way his own father had failed him. Arthur began pushing John, not with the harsh criticism he'd used before, but with tough love aimed at making John into the man his family needed him to be. When John complained about domestic life being boring compared to the outlaw adventure, Arthur reminded him what adventure had cost them all. When John wavered in his commitment to Abigail and Jack, Arthur forced him to confront the consequences of abandonment. These conversations revealed something Arthur had never acknowledged: he cared about John like a brother. More than that, he cared about John's future in a way that transcended gang loyalty. Arthur wanted John to survive, to thrive, to build something better than what they'd all known. And this desire was rooted not in strategic thinking but in genuine love. Abigail Roberts represented another revelation for Arthur. He'd always respected her strength and determination, but now he saw her clearly, a woman trying to save her family from a life that would destroy them. Her constant pressure on John to leave the gang wasn't nagging, it was desperation. She could see where their path led, and she was fighting to pull the people she loved off that path before it was too late. Arthur found himself supporting Abigail's efforts, subtly and then more openly. He encouraged John to listen to her concerns, helped her navigate gang politics when Dutch's paranoia made life dangerous for anyone who questioned their direction. In Abigail, Arthur saw what he wished he could have been, someone fighting for love instead of loyalty, for family instead of abstract ideals. And Jack Marston, innocent, curious, intelligent Jack, became perhaps the strongest symbol of what Arthur was fighting to protect. This boy represented possibility, a chance for something better to emerge from their violent world. When Arthur looked at Jack, he didn't see a future outlaw. He saw potential for goodness that needed to be nurtured and protected. The contrast between Jack's innocence and the gang's increasing brutality became stark. Dutch spoke of building a better world, but what kind of world was he actually creating for Jack? One where violence was the answer to every problem, where loyalty was more important than morality, where might made right and the weak deserved whatever happened to them. Arthur couldn't accept that future for Jack. More importantly, he realized he didn't want to accept that future for anyone. The tuberculosis was killing his body, but it was giving birth to his conscience. And that conscience was telling him that everything he'd spent his adult life building was wrong. This realization created an impossible situation. Arthur's loyalty to Dutch and the gang remained strong. These people were his family, the only family he'd ever really known. But his growing moral awareness made it increasingly difficult to participate in their activities. How do you remain loyal to people whose actions you can no longer justify? The answer, Arthur was beginning to understand, lay not in choosing between loyalty and morality, but in redefining what loyalty actually meant. Real loyalty wasn't about blind obedience to a leader's wishes. It was about staying true to the best version of what you shared together. And the best version of the Van der Linde gang, the version Arthur remembered from better days, would never have become what they were becoming. So Arthur began fighting for that better version. Not through rebellion or confrontation, but through example. By showing mercy when others showed cruelty. By protecting the innocent when others preyed on them. By putting family before abstract ideals, love before loyalty, and hope before desperation. It was a losing battle. Arthur knew that even as he fought it. Dutch was too far gone, Micah too poisonous, the gang too broken to be saved. But that didn't matter anymore. Arthur wasn't fighting to win. He was fighting to prove that a different way was possible. He was fighting to show Jack, to show John, to show anyone paying attention, that strength and goodness could coexist. And in that fight, Arthur Morgan began to discover who he really was underneath all the years of violence and loyalty. Not Dutch's enforcer. Not the gang's muscle. Just a man trying to do right in his final days, trying to build something good on the foundation of a wasted life. That man would soon face the ultimate test of his newfound principles. And in that test, Arthur Morgan would prove that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is let go of everything you once thought made you strong. The final days came faster than Arthur expected. The tuberculosis was winning its war against his body, each coughing fit more violent than the last, each day bringing new weakness, new limitations, new reminders that time was running out. But even as his physical strength ebbed away, Arthur's moral clarity grew stronger. He knew what he had to do. Dutch's final plan was madness disguised as brilliance. One last score, he promised, enough money to disappear forever, to finally achieve the freedom they'd always dreamed of. But Arthur could see the truth beneath Dutch's desperate rhetoric. This wasn't about freedom, it was about ego. Dutch couldn't accept that his time had passed, that his vision had failed, that everything he'd built was crumbling. So he was willing to sacrifice everyone and everything for one final attempt at relevance. The plan required splitting the gang, taking enormous risks, trusting people who had already proven themselves untrustworthy. Arthur tried to voice his concerns, but Dutch no longer listened to him. Micah had poisoned that well too thoroughly, convincing Dutch that Arthur's illness had made him weak, unreliable, more concerned with sentiment than survival. But Arthur wasn't concerned with survival anymore, his own or the gang's. He was concerned with salvation. Not in a religious sense, though he'd found himself thinking more about God and redemption as death approached. But in a practical sense. Who could be saved from the disaster that was about to unfold? Who deserved a chance at something better? The answer was clear: John, Abigail, and Jack. They were the only ones with both the desire and the opportunity to build a different life. John was young enough to change, strong enough to protect his family, and finally mature enough to understand what was at stake. Abigail had the wisdom and determination to guide that change. And Jack, innocent Jack, deserved a chance to grow up in a world where violence wasn't the solution to every problem. Arthur made his choice. Not the choice Dutch wanted him to make, not the choice that served the gang's interests, but the choice that served love over loyalty, hope over desperation, future over past. He would help John's family escape, even if it meant betraying everything he'd once held sacred. The plan was simple in concept but devastating in execution. Arthur would create a diversion, drawing Dutch and Micah's attention away from John's escape route. He would make it clear that he was choosing John over Dutch, family over gang, what was right over what was expected. And he would pay the ultimate price for that choice. But first there were things that needed to be said. Conversations that couldn't be delayed, truths that couldn't remain unspoken, relationships that needed to be properly concluded before Arthur's story ended. The conversation with John was the hardest. How do you tell someone you love like a brother that you're about to die for them? How do you explain that their future is more important than your present? How do you say goodbye to someone who's been part of your life for over a decade? Arthur didn't use flowery words or dramatic speeches. That wasn't his way. Instead, he spoke plainly, honestly, from the heart that the tuberculosis had somehow made larger even as it destroyed his lungs. He told John that being a father was the most important job he'd ever have, that Abigail and Jack needed him to be better than what the gang had made them all become. He gave John practical advice about survival, about building a legitimate life, about being the kind of man worth following. But most importantly, Arthur gave John permission to leave. Permission to abandon the gang's twisted version of loyalty in favor of something real and lasting. Permission to choose love over adventure, responsibility over freedom, family over gang. It was a gift Arthur wished someone had given him 15 years earlier. The conversation with Abigail was shorter but no less meaningful. Arthur acknowledged what he'd always known but never said, that she was right about everything. Right about John's potential for good, right about the need to leave the gang, right about the kind of life Jack deserved. He promised her that John would become the man she needed him to be, and he meant it. Because Arthur was going to make sure John had no choice but to live up to that promise. And Jack, what do you say to a child when you're about to die for his future? Arthur kept it simple. He told Jack to be good to his parents, to study hard, to remember that being strong meant protecting people weaker than yourself. He gave Jack his journal, filled with drawings and thoughts from their travels, a record of both the beauty and the ugliness they'd seen together. Maybe someday when Jack was older, he'd understand what Arthur had been trying to tell him through those pages. Then came the hardest conversation of all, the one with Dutch. Not because Arthur expected to change Dutch's mind or save their relationship, but because Arthur needed to say goodbye to the man who'd been a father to him, even if that man no longer existed. Dutch barely listened. His attention was focused on the plan, on Micah's whispered strategies, on anything except the dying man who'd served him faithfully for 15 years. When Arthur tried to express his concerns about the gang's direction, Dutch dismissed them as the delusional ramblings of a sick mind. When Arthur suggested they should focus on getting everyone to safety instead of chasing one more score, Dutch accused him of cowardice. But Arthur pressed on because some things needed to be said even if they wouldn't be heard. He told Dutch what the gang had once meant to him: family, purpose, a sense of belonging in a world that had no place for people like them. He reminded Dutch of the principles they'd once shared: protecting the innocent, standing up to bullies, building something better than what existed before. And finally, Arthur told Dutch the truth that Micah would never speak, that real leadership meant knowing when to let go, that a true father figure would want what was best for his children, even if it meant admitting his own failures. That love sometimes requires sacrifice, and the greatest sacrifice a leader can make is accepting that his time has passed. Dutch's response was predictable: anger, accusations of betrayal, claims that Arthur's illness had corrupted his judgment. But Arthur saw something else in Dutch's eyes. Fear. Fear that Arthur was right, that everything was falling apart, that the dream they'd built together was becoming a nightmare. That fear told Arthur everything he needed to know. Deep down, Dutch understood the truth. He just wasn't strong enough to accept it. And that weakness, more than Micah's manipulation or the Pinkertons' pressure or Arthur's rebellion, was what would ultimately destroy everything they'd built together. But Arthur was done trying to save Dutch from himself. He had more important work to do. The final confrontation came at sunrise, because all the most important moments in Arthur's life seemed to happen at sunrise. The golden light streaming through the mountains reminded him of mornings in camp when the gang was still a family, when Dutch's dreams still seemed achievable, when Arthur's only worry was completing whatever job had been assigned to him. Those days were gone forever. In their place was this moment: Arthur Morgan, dying and alone, facing the choice that would define not just his death but the meaning of his entire life. Dutch and Micah had discovered John's escape attempt. They were pursuing him with lethal intent, determined to make an example of anyone who dared put family loyalty above gang loyalty. Arthur knew that if they caught John, Abigail and Jack would die too, either in the initial violence or in the desperate life of constant running that would follow. So Arthur made his stand. Not the heroic, guns-blazing stand of legend, but something quieter and more powerful. He simply refused to move. He positioned himself between Dutch's pursuit and John's escape route, and he made it clear that anyone who wanted to harm John's family would have to go through him first. The confrontation that followed revealed everything about who these men had become. Micah, predictably, was eager for violence, seeing Arthur's defiance as an opportunity to eliminate a rival for Dutch's attention. He sneered about Arthur's weakness, his sentimentality, his failure to understand what real loyalty meant. But it was Dutch's reaction that broke Arthur's heart. The man who had raised him, who had saved him from a life of poverty and meaninglessness, who had taught him about literature and philosophy and the possibility of building something better than what existed, that man looked at Arthur with cold calculation and asked a simple question: "Are you with us or against us?" Arthur's answer was the most important words he ever spoke. I'm with what's right. Not with Dutch. Not with the gang. Not with the twisted version of loyalty that demanded blind obedience regardless of consequences. But with what was right. With protecting the innocent. With putting love above abstract ideals. With ensuring that Jack Marston grew up in a world where good men still existed. The fight that followed wasn't really a fight at all. Arthur was too weak from tuberculosis to match Micah's strength or speed. But he didn't need to win, he just needed to delay long enough for John to get his family to safety. Every second Arthur remained standing was another second for love to triumph over loyalty, for family to escape the destruction of the gang, for hope to survive in a world that seemed determined to crush it. Arthur fought not with his fists or his guns but with his will. His refusal to surrender, to back down, to admit that Micah was right about strength and weakness. Even as his body failed him, even as blood filled his lungs and his vision blurred, Arthur continued standing. Because standing up for what's right isn't about winning, it's about proving that some things are worth any sacrifice. When Arthur finally fell, he fell knowing that John was free. Free to build the life Arthur had never allowed himself to imagine. Free to be the father Arthur had never had, the husband Arthur had never been, the man Arthur was only learning to become in his final moments. But Arthur's story didn't end with his death. It continued in John's choices, in Jack's future, in the proof that one man's sacrifice could create space for other men to choose differently. Arthur Morgan died as he had lived his final months, not for glory or recognition but for love. And in that death, he achieved something that had eluded him throughout his violent life. He became genuinely heroic. The last thing Arthur saw was the sunrise painting the mountains gold, the same light that had illuminated so many mornings when the world was young and full of possibility. In that light, Arthur found peace. Not because his death was painless or his regrets were few, but because he knew he had finally chosen correctly. He had put love before loyalty, sacrifice before self-interest, what was right before what was expected. Arthur Morgan taught us that true masculinity isn't about never showing weakness. It's about choosing to be strong for others when being strong for yourself no longer matters. It's about understanding that real loyalty sometimes requires betrayal of false authority. It's about recognizing that the most powerful thing a man can do is admit he was wrong and spend his remaining time making it right. Most importantly, Arthur Morgan showed us how to die well. Not by avoiding death or pretending it isn't coming, but by using the knowledge of mortality to clarify what really matters. In his final months, Arthur accomplished more good than he had in decades of loyal service to Dutch's vision. Because when you know your time is limited, you stop wasting it on things that don't matter and focus everything on things that do. Arthur Morgan's redemption wasn't about erasing his past or achieving forgiveness for his crimes. It was about choosing, in his final moments, to be the man he always had the potential to become. And in making that choice, he proved that it's never too late to change, never too late to choose love over fear, never too late to stand up for what's right. That's the lesson Arthur Morgan left us. Not that good men never fall, but that fallen men can choose to stand for something greater than themselves. Not that heroes never fail, but that failure can be the beginning of heroism if we're brave enough to learn from it. Arthur Morgan died well because he learned to live well. And in teaching us that lesson, he became immortal in the way that truly matters, as an example of what we could become if we found the courage to choose love over loyalty, sacrifice over safety, and hope over despair. The sun set on Arthur Morgan's life, but it rose on the possibility that other men, inspired by his example, might choose to be better than they were. In the end, that's the greatest gift any of us can give the world, proof that change is possible, that redemption is real, and that dying well begins with learning to live for something greater than ourselves.